The iron chains were forged thick enough to hold a bull, wrapped around wrists the size of fence posts, anchored to beams that had supported tobacco loads for 3 generations. The men who locked Henry Boone inside that barn believed no human strength could break such restraints. They were wrong. By sunrise, nothing remained but splinters scattered across the muddy field, twisted metal lying in impossible shapes, and footprints that led nowhere. Some say a giant still walks the Carolina forests, watching from shadows deeper than night. Others claim the storm that came that evening carried something darker than rain. But the real truth about what happened in that barn starts long before the thunder rolled across the plantation fields. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Winthrop plantation spread across 2,000 acres of Carolina lowlands, rich soil that turned cotton into gold and human beings into property. Malcolm Winthrop had inherited the land from his father, along with the certainty that some men were born to rule and others to serve. His sons, Preston and Dalton, had grown up believing the same, their worldview shaped by privilege and the casual cruelty that came with absolute power over other lives. They were young men in their 20s, educated enough to read Latin but ignorant of the depths of human resilience, bored enough to seek entertainment in the suffering of those they owned. Henry Boone arrived at the Winthrop plantation on a sweltering August afternoon in 1857, purchased at auction in Charleston for $3,000, a price that reflected his extraordinary size and apparent strength. The slave trader who sold him, a gaunt man named Crenshaw with tobacco-stained teeth, warned Malcolm that this particular purchase came with a mysterious history. Henry had been found wandering the docks of Savannah 3 months prior, disoriented and speaking a dialect of English mixed with languages Crenshaw could not identify. No records existed of his origin, no previous owner stepped forward to claim him, and the circumstances of his appearance remained unexplained. The first thing anyone noticed about Henry was his height. He stood well over 7 feet, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorframe and hands that could palm a man's skull like an apple. His skin was dark as mahogany, marked with scars that suggested violence survived, stories written in scar tissue that he never volunteered to explain. His face held a quality of ancient patience, eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the people around him. And he moved with a grace unusual for someone his size, each step deliberate and economical. Most striking was his silence. Henry spoke perhaps a dozen words in his first month at Winthrop Plantation, responding to orders with nods or simple gestures, never initiating conversation, never complaining about the brutal labor assigned to him. Preston Winthrop first conceived the idea of displaying Henry after a dinner party where visiting planters had expressed disbelief at descriptions of the giant slave. Preston was 24, handsome in the way of men who had never known hunger or uncertainty, with carefully styled hair and an expensive wardrobe imported from Europe. He possessed his father's sense of entitlement amplified by youth's thoughtless cruelty, the kind of man who pulled wings off flies as a child and graduated to bigger game as he aged. His brother Dalton, 2 years younger, followed Preston's lead in most things, less inventive in his malice but equally committed to maintaining the social order that placed them at the top. The barn selected for Henry's display stood at the eastern edge of the main compound, a sturdy structure built from Carolina pine with a foundation of fieldstone. It had previously stored equipment and occasional livestock, but Preston ordered it cleared and modified for its new purpose. Heavy chains were commissioned from a blacksmith in town, links as thick as a man's thumb, attached to iron cuffs padded with leather to prevent damage to valuable property. The chains were anchored to the barn's central support beam, allowing Henry perhaps 15 feet of movement in any direction, enough to stand and walk, but not enough to reach the doors or windows. The arrangement began simply enough. Henry was brought to the barn each evening after field work concluded, chained for the night, then released at dawn to return to his labor. Preston justified this to his father as a security measure, claiming that a man of Henry's size posed a danger if allowed to roam freely after dark. Malcolm accepted this reasoning without much thought, his attention focused on cotton prices and political maneuvering as tensions between North and South grew increasingly hostile. But Preston's true motivation revealed itself within the week when he began inviting guests to view his acquisition. The viewing started with neighboring planters, men who brought their sons to marvel at human size taken to its extreme limits. Preston charged nothing for these early shows, content with the social capital gained from possessing such a curiosity. Henry stood or sat as directed, silent and apparently docile, while men walked circles around him, commenting on his proportions the way they might discuss a prized horse. Some visitors brought measuring tapes, recording Henry's height, arm span, and chest circumference in small notebooks. Others simply stared, their faces showing mixtures of fear and fascination at this reminder that human beings came in forms that challenged comfortable categories. Dalton took particular pleasure in demonstrating Henry's strength. He would order the giant to lift heavy objects, barrels filled with sand or anvils from the blacksmith's shop, watching as Henry complied without visible strain. The younger Winthrop brother developed a routine where he stood beside Henry, instructing visitors to note the contrast, laughing as he emphasized that such a creature could snap a normal man in half, if not properly controlled. The chains became central to this narrative, symbols of civilization's mastery over raw nature, proof that even the most physically powerful human remained subject to those with the intelligence and will to dominate. But Henry's silence masked depths that Preston and Dalton never suspected. The scars covering his body told stories they never thought to question. The oldest marks faded to pale lines against dark skin dated from his childhood in a village along the West African coast where he had been born into a family of fishermen. His real name was not Henry Boone, but something longer and more musical, a name in a language the Winthrops could not have pronounced. He remembered his mother's face, the smell of cooking fires, the sound of drums carrying messages across distances. He remembered raiders coming in the night, remembered chains even then, remembered the suffocating darkness of a ship's hold during the Middle Passage. The fresher scars carried more recent histories. Henry had not exaggerated when slave traders described him as having mysterious origins. The truth was he had escaped twice before, each time under circumstances that seemed impossible. The first escape came during a storm off the Carolina coast when the ship transporting him struck rocks and began to sink. Henry had broken his restraints in the chaos, fought his way to the deck through rising water, and somehow survived hours in the ocean before washing ashore. The second escape occurred 6 months later from a plantation in Georgia, where he had slipped his chains during a night of torrential rain and vanished into the wilderness. Both times, trackers had lost his trail in impossible ways, footprints simply ending as though he had dissolved into air. Henry's recapture in Savannah had been almost voluntary. He had grown weary of running, weary of the constant vigilance required to avoid slave catchers, weary of the violence that shadowed every moment of freedom in a world built to enslave him. So when Crenshaw's men found him at the docks, he did not resist. He allowed himself to be shackled again, allowed himself to be sold again, all the while knowing that docility was a choice he could revoke whenever circumstances demanded. The Winthrops mistook his silence for simple-mindedness, his compliance for weakness. They could not have been more wrong. As summer faded into autumn, Preston's exhibitions grew more elaborate and more frequent. Word spread through the county about the giant in the Winthrop barn, and visitors began arriving from increasingly distant locations. Some came from as far as Virginia or Georgia, making special trips to see what they initially dismissed as exaggeration. Preston began charging admission, $5 per person, $10 for families, using the revenue to fund his gambling habits and expensive tastes. The barn became a regular feature on the social calendar for the region's planter class, a curiosity to visit between cotton harvests and political debates. The viewing protocols evolved into something approaching theatrical performance. Preston installed better lighting, oil lamps arranged to cast dramatic shadows that emphasized Henry's size. He commissioned a small platform where visitors could stand to feel even smaller by comparison, a staging choice that both frightened and titillated his audience. Dalton composed a speech he delivered before each showing, describing Henry in terms usually reserved for wild animals, emphasizing danger contained, primal strength brought under civilized control. The brothers never considered how these performances might be perceived by the man at their center. Never imagined that behind Henry's impassive face lived a mind that cataloged every word, every gesture, every instance of casual dehumanization. The other enslaved people at Winthrop Plantation viewed Henry's situation with mixed emotions. Some felt pity, recognizing the special cruelty of his display even within the broader context of slavery's horrors. Others maintained careful distance, superstitious about his size and silence, repeating rumors that he was touched by something beyond normal human experience. An older woman named Miriam, who worked in the main house and possessed influence among the enslaved community, made efforts to bring Henry extra food when possible, slipping cornbread or fruit into his hands during the brief moments between his display hours and field work. She never spoke more than a few words to him, but her eyes carried understanding, recognition of shared suffering across the vast gulf of their different circumstances. October brought cooler weather and an uptick in visitors as the harvest season concluded and planters found themselves with leisure time. Preston organized special evening viewings, charging premium prices for the novelty of seeing the giant by lamplight. These sessions often devolved into drinking parties, groups of men passing bottles of whiskey while they circled Henry, their comments growing cruder as inhibitions dissolved. Some visitors prodded him with walking sticks, testing his reactions, laughing when he remained motionless. Others proposed experiments to test his strength or endurance, suggestions that Preston occasionally accepted for additional fees. One particularly degrading evening in late October, a visitor from Alabama offered $50 to wrestle Henry. Preston accepted immediately, seeing opportunity for profit and entertainment. The visitor was himself a large man, over 6 feet tall, with the build of someone who performed physical labor, confident in his abilities and eager to boast about battling a giant. The match, if it could be called that, lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Henry stood passively as the man charged him, then simply caught his opponent mid-rush and lifted him overhead with no visible effort. The man flailed and shouted to be put down, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine terror at finding himself suspended 8 feet above the ground, held by hands strong enough to crush his ribs if they chose. Preston ordered Henry to release the man, laughing at the visitor's humiliation, pocketing the $50 with satisfaction. But something changed in Henry during that brief wrestling match. For the first time since his arrival, his eyes had shown something other than passive acceptance. For just a moment, as he held that man above his head, something ancient and fierce had flickered across his face. A reminder that size and strength meant power that could flow in directions his captors had not considered. Preston noticed nothing. Dalton noticed nothing, but Miriam, who had been passing by the barn during the spectacle, saw that flash of something dangerous and filed it away in her memory. November arrived with unseasonably warm weather that made fieldwork brutal and left everyone irritable. The cotton harvest was proceeding slower than Malcolm Winthrop preferred, his frustration trickling down through overseers to the enslaved workers who bore the physical consequences of delayed schedules. Henry worked alongside others in the fields during daylight hours, his height allowing him to pick cotton from higher branches without a ladder, his strength allowing him to haul loaded sacks that would have required 2 normal men. The overseers drove everyone harder as deadlines approached, their whips cracking frequently, their curses constant. Preston's exhibitions continued without pause, the revenue too lucrative to abandon even as plantation work intensified. Henry found himself sleeping perhaps 3 hours per night, chained in the barn after full days in the fields, awakened by visitors at all hours as Preston accommodated anyone willing to pay his fees. Exhaustion accumulated in Henry's body like a debt that would eventually come due. His movements in the fields grew more mechanical, his already minimal speech dwindling to nothing, his eyes taking on a quality of distance that worried even the hardest overseers. But when visitors came to the barn, he still stood as directed, still lifted weights as commanded, still played his assigned role as spectacle and curiosity. The weather finally broke in mid-November, autumn chill arriving suddenly with winds that stripped leaves from trees and sent field hands scrambling for inadequate clothing. Malcolm ordered fires lit in the main house, complained about the cost of heating such a large structure, and worried aloud about cotton prices as national tensions over slavery's expansion threatened economic stability. Preston and Dalton barely noticed the temperature drop, insulated by privilege and warmed by alcohol consumed increasingly frequently. Their exhibitions continued, the barn now heated by a large iron stove that made the space uncomfortably warm and filled the air with smoke that stung Henry's eyes and lungs. It was during one of these late November exhibitions that Henry first spoke more than a single word since his arrival. A visitor from Charleston, a physician with scientific pretensions, had brought instruments to measure Henry's skull dimensions, expounding theories about cranial capacity and racial hierarchies while his calipers clicked against bone. The physician lectured his audience about biological determinism, using Henry as evidence for claims about intellectual capacity correlating with physical characteristics, his voice confident, and his theories absolute nonsense disguised as science. Henry endured the measurements in silence, as he endured everything until the physician made a particularly absurd claim about skull shape indicating docility and lack of imagination. "You are wrong," Henry said, his voice deep and resonant, startling everyone in the barn. The physician stepped back, surprised that his specimen possessed speech. Preston moved forward, hand on the pistol he carried whenever Henry was unchained for demonstrations. But Henry did not move, did not threaten, simply met the physician's eyes with a gaze that carried intelligence the doctor's theories claimed could not exist. "You understand nothing," Henry continued, his English perfect and unaccented. "You measure bones and think you measure souls. You are fools playing with numbers while the world you built collapses around you." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Preston broke it by laughing, a forced sound that carried uncertainty beneath its bluster. "The beast speaks," he announced to the gathered visitors. "Though he speaks nonsense. Prophecy from a slave, how amusing." The other visitors joined his laughter, though several looked disturbed, recognition flickering across their faces that the man in chains possessed depths their comfortable prejudices could not accommodate. The physician packed his instruments with hands that trembled slightly, declining Preston's offer of refreshment, leaving earlier than planned. After the visitors departed, Preston stood before Henry, whiskey on his breath and anger in his posture. "You don't speak unless spoken to," he said, his voice carrying the petulance of someone whose authority had been challenged. "You don't think unless ordered to think. You exist for our entertainment and our profit, nothing more. Do you understand?" Henry returned to his customary silence. His brief moment of speech concluded, but something in his stillness felt different now, less passive, and more like a predator waiting for the right moment. Preston did not notice, satisfied that his authority remained intact. But Dalton, who was slightly more perceptive than his brother, felt unease settling in his stomach like bad food. The incident with the physician marked a subtle shift in the barn's atmosphere. Subsequent visitors seemed less comfortable, their laughter more nervous, their time viewing Henry shorter. Some requested their admission fees refunded, claiming the giant was less impressive than advertised, though the real reason for their discomfort remained unspoken. Preston compensated by drinking more and becoming more aggressive in his showmanship, staging increasingly elaborate demonstrations of Henry's strength, pushing boundaries of what could be called entertainment versus cruelty. He had a platform built where Henry could stand while multiple men hung from his extended arms, proving that even 5 or 6 adults could not pull him down through their combined weight. December brought true cold, frost coating the ground in the mornings and ice forming in water barrels. The harvest was finally complete, cotton bales stacked in warehouses awaiting transport to coastal markets. The enslaved population at Winthrop Plantation received their winter clothing allotment. Thin blankets and threadbare coats insufficient for the weather but better than nothing. Henry received nothing extra, his size making standard clothing useless, his nightly confinement in the barn meaning exposure to temperatures that would have killed a smaller man. But cold affected him less than it should have, his body generating heat that kept him functional if not comfortable. Another oddity that visitors commented upon without understanding. Preston's exhibitions continued through December despite declining attendance. The cold kept casual visitors away, but Preston compensated by offering private viewings at higher prices for the truly wealthy, or those with particular interests in human curiosities. These private sessions allowed for interactions that would have been impossible with larger audiences, visitors who wished to conduct their own experiments or satisfy darker curiosities away from witnesses. Preston accepted all offers that came with sufficient payment, his morals flexible and his imagination limited when it came to understanding cruelty's consequences. One such private viewing in late December involved a visiting overseer from a Louisiana sugar plantation, a massive man named Garrett, who specialized in breaking rebellious slaves through physical intimidation. Garrett had heard of Henry and wanted to assess whether the giant's size would make him useful on a sugar plantation where work killed men regularly, and fresh bodies were always needed. Preston welcomed him enthusiastically, seeing potential for a lucrative sale if Henry could be moved to Louisiana for even higher prices than the admission fees currently generated. Garrett entered the barn with confidence, surveyed Henry with a practiced eye, and immediately began testing the boundaries of what this particular slave would tolerate. He started with verbal abuse, obscenities and threats delivered in a voice accustomed to being obeyed, watching for any flicker of response. Henry remained motionless, his face impassive. Garrett escalated to physical contact, shoving Henry's shoulder, slapping his face, pulling his hair, searching for a breaking point or reaction that would reveal character. Henry absorbed each provocation like stone absorbing rainwater, showing nothing, giving nothing. Frustrated, Garrett pulled a short whip from his belt and struck Henry across the chest, raising a welt that drew blood. Preston started to object, concerned about damaging valuable property, but Garrett waved him off, insisting he knew what he was doing, promising to pay for any permanent damage. The whipping continued for several minutes, Garrett's arm rising and falling with practiced rhythm, the leather cord raising welts across Henry's torso and arms. Blood began to flow more freely, staining the straw covering the barn floor. Preston watched with growing discomfort, recognizing that he had lost control of the situation but uncertain how to reclaim it without offending a potentially valuable buyer. Dalton had left the barn entirely, unwilling to witness what was happening, his earlier enthusiasm for cruelty meeting its limits. Through it all, Henry made no sound, shed no tear, showed no sign of pain or fear or anger, his silence more profound than any scream could have been. Garrett finally stopped, breathing heavily from exertion, frustrated that he could not provoke the reaction he sought. "This one's broken already," he announced to Preston. "Whatever spirit he had is gone. He'd be useless on my plantation because there's nothing left to break. Slaves need some fire in them to be worth the effort of controlling. This one's just empty." He threw the whip at Henry's feet in disgust, paid Preston $50 for the wasted time, and departed into the cold night, disappointed that his trip had yielded no opportunity for purchase or entertainment. After Garrett left, Preston approached Henry with a water bucket and cloth, attempting to clean the wounds his guest had inflicted. "I apologize for that," he said, his voice carrying something almost like regret. "Garrett went further than I anticipated. You performed well, though, very stoic. I'll make sure Miriam brings you extra food tonight." Henry looked at Preston with eyes that seemed to see through flesh to the soul beneath. If indeed Preston possessed such a thing. And for a moment, the younger Winthrop felt genuine fear. Recognition that he stood within easy reach of hands that could end his life before he could draw the pistol at his belt. But the moment passed, Henry looked away, and Preston convinced himself he had imagined the threat. The wounds from Garrett's whip healed slowly, complicated by Henry's continuing work schedule and nightly confinement that prevented proper rest. Miriam treated them when she could, bringing herb poultices and clean bandages stolen from the main house's medical supplies. She worked in silence, her hands gentle, her eyes avoiding Henry's face as though looking directly at him might reveal truths she was not prepared to acknowledge. Other enslaved workers began avoiding the barn entirely, their superstitious fears growing as stories spread about Henry's absolute stoicism under punishment, his inhuman endurance, his silence that seemed less like submission and more like the calm before catastrophic storms. Christmas came and went, celebrated in the main house with feasts and music, while the enslaved population received small allotments of extra food and a single day free from field work. Preston and Dalton hosted a holiday party that stretched across 3 days, their guests drinking and gambling while Henry remained chained in the barn, exhibited occasionally when particularly drunk visitors wanted to see the famous giant. Malcolm Winthrop, increasingly concerned about political developments as southern states threatened secession over the slavery question, drank heavily and lectured anyone who would listen about states' rights and the sanctity of property. The enslaved workers who served the party moved through the house like ghosts, invisible to guests who consumed the products of their labor without acknowledging their humanity. The new year of 1858 arrived with little fanfare and considerable anxiety among the planter class. Political tensions had reached breaking points in multiple states. Violence erupting in Kansas over whether new territories would permit slavery. John Brown's raids making headlines and fueling fears of widespread rebellion. The national fabric tearing along fault lines that had existed since the Constitution's creation. Malcolm worried about his investments, Preston worried about maintaining his lifestyle if slavery ended, and Dalton worried about nothing much at all beyond his next bottle and his next gambling debt. None of them worried about Henry, who watched and listened and waited with patience learned across years of surviving impossible situations. January brought freezing rain that turned the plantation into a sea of mud and made fieldwork impossible. The enslaved population huddled in their inadequate quarters, burning whatever scraps they could find for warmth, suffering through illnesses that Malcolm considered acceptable losses against the cost of providing better shelter. Preston's exhibitions slowed during the worst weather, though he still conducted occasional private viewings for visitors willing to pay premium prices and brave dangerous roads. Henry remained in the barn continuously now. Preston deciding it was more efficient to keep him permanently confined rather than moving him back and forth in the mud. Food arrived twice daily, delivered by whoever drew the short straw among the house staff, left just inside the barn door while the deliverer avoided looking at the giant chained in the shadows. It was during one of these January storms, ice pelting the barn's roof like thrown gravel, wind howling through gaps in the walls, that Henry first attempted to break his chains. He waited until full darkness, until he was certain no visitors would arrive, until the storm's noise would cover any sounds he made. Then he simply pulled, testing the limits of iron forged to hold animals, not minds capable of strategy and patience. The chains held, but barely, the links groaning under stress they were never designed to accommodate. Henry stopped before anything broke, not yet ready to commit to escape, but satisfied that when the moment came, the chains would not hold him. He resumed this testing over subsequent nights, always during storms when noise provided cover, always stopping before actual failure, learning the chain's weaknesses and the beam's structural limits. The chains were strong, but the beam was old, 3 decades of supporting tobacco loads having created microscopic fractures that Henry's pulls widened incrementally. The wood groaned and flexed with each test, sawdust falling like snow from points where his chains attached. Preston noticed nothing during his occasional checks, seeing only his giant standing docile as always, never imagining that escape was being planned with care and precision. February arrived with slightly warmer weather and renewed visitor traffic as roads became passable. Preston increased his advertising, placing notices in newspapers across multiple states, describing Henry in terms that blurred line between human and curiosity, promising experiences that could not be found elsewhere. Business improved, visitors arriving in groups, some traveling considerable distances, paying Preston's inflated fees without complaint. The exhibitions grew longer and more elaborate, Preston now offering package deals that included viewing time, demonstrations of strength, and opportunities for visitors to pose beside Henry for daguerreotype photographs that they could show friends and family as evidence of their adventures. The photography sessions particularly galled Henry. Forced to stand motionless while visitors arranged themselves around him in poses suggesting conquest or dominance, photographers ducking under black cloths and working with flash powders that hurt his eyes. These photographs would survive long after everything else, images captured on metal plates showing a giant man in chains surrounded by smiling white faces, evidence frozen in time of casual cruelty that those being photographed considered normal and unremarkable. Henry endured these sessions as he endured everything, but his mind catalogued each face, each name mentioned in conversation, each laugh at his expense, storing information for purposes his captors could not imagine. March brought spring weather and political developments that dominated conversation at every viewing. Several southern states had formally threatened secession if the federal government attempted to restrict slavery's expansion, and violence between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions had escalated across border regions. Malcolm Winthrop entertained visitors with increasingly extreme rhetoric about Southern rights and Northern aggression, his speeches growing more passionate as his economic anxieties intensified. Preston and Dalton absorbed their father's politics without critical thought, repeating slogans about property rights and racial hierarchies as though these were natural laws rather than constructed justifications for exploitation. Henry listened to these political discussions during exhibitions when visitors gathered in the barn to view him while debating national issues. He heard arguments about whether enslaved people were fully human, whether they possessed souls, whether they felt pain the same way white people did, whether slavery represented kindness or cruelty. The certainty with which visitors delivered obviously false claims would have been comical if the stakes had not involved millions of lives and generations of suffering. Henry never responded to these discussions, maintaining his silence even when directly addressed with questions about his own experiences or opinions, recognizing that any answer would be twisted to serve arguments already concluded. On a warm evening in late March, Miriam arrived at the barn with Henry's dinner to find Preston hosting a dozen visitors for an extended viewing session. She set the food just inside the door as usual and turned to leave. But Preston called her back, struck by sudden inspiration. "Here's something interesting," he announced to his guests. "This woman has worked in our house for 20 years. And I'd wager she's never had a real conversation with our giant. Let's see if they can even communicate, shall we? Miriam, go speak to Henry. Tell us what you think of him." Miriam stood frozen, recognizing the trap being set, knowing that any answer would be wrong and any resistance would be punished. She slowly approached Henry, her eyes downcast in the posture of deference she had perfected over decades of survival, stopping several feet away from where he sat. "Good evening," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Henry looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since his arrival. Their eyes met, and in that moment, a lifetime of shared understanding passed between them. Recognition that they were both human beings struggling to maintain dignity in a system designed to destroy it. "Good evening," Henry replied, his voice gentle despite its depth. "Thank you for the kindness you have shown me." The simplicity of his statement and the obvious intelligence behind it created uncomfortable silence among the visitors. Challenge to comfortable assumptions about enslaved people's capacity for sophisticated thought and feeling. Preston broke the tension with forced laughter, dismissing the exchange as trained behavior rather than genuine communication. But several visitors looked disturbed, their evening's entertainment soured by unexpected reminders of humanity where they had expected to find objects. After the visitors left, Preston stood before Henry, anger evident in his posture. "You will not speak to the house slaves," he commanded. "You will not speak to anyone unless I give permission. You are here to be looked at, nothing more. Do you understand?" Henry returned to silence. His brief conversation with Miriam concluded, but something had shifted in the barn's atmosphere. Preston felt it, a change he could not articulate, a sense that control he believed absolute was actually more fragile than he imagined. He left the barn troubled, though he would have been unable to explain why, locking the door with more force than necessary. Miriam returned hours later, well after midnight, carrying blankets she had stolen from the main house stores. She entered the barn, quietly approaching Henry where he sat against the wall, his chains arranged to allow sleep, though comfort was impossible. "These will help with the cold," she whispered, spreading the blankets within his reach. Henry nodded his thanks, then spoke in the same quiet voice. "When the time comes, go to the cellar beneath the main house and stay there until morning. Do not come outside no matter what you hear. Tell the others." Miriam started to ask what he meant, but something in his eyes stopped her questions. She simply nodded and left, her heart pounding with fear and something that might have been hope. April arrived with storms, unusual weather patterns that saw tornadoes touching down across the region and flooding that destroyed crops and damaged buildings throughout the county. Malcolm Winthrop worried about financial losses, Preston worried about reduced visitor traffic, and the enslaved population worried about being forced to repair storm damage while receiving blame for acts of God. Henry watched the weather with keen interest, noting wind patterns and cloud formations, remembering storms from his past, particularly the storm that had destroyed the ship carrying him across the ocean, and the storm that had covered his escape in Georgia. He understood weather in ways his captors did not, recognized signs they missed, knew that something significant was building in the atmosphere. The exhibitions continued despite the weather. Preston unwilling to lose revenue even as conditions made travel dangerous. Fewer visitors came, but those who did paid higher prices for the privilege of viewing Henry during dramatic storms, lightning visible through the barn's windows, thunder rattling the walls, rain hammering the roof with percussion that made conversation difficult. Preston staged nighttime viewings during the worst storms, charging premium fees, creating atmosphere that turned the exhibitions into something like theater. Henry cast as the monster and the storm as dramatic backdrop. He did not realize he was writing a script that would have a much different ending than he imagined. On the evening of April 21st, Miriam came to the barn with Henry's dinner to find Preston preparing for what he promised would be the greatest exhibition yet. A major storm was forecast, with severe weather warnings suggesting possible tornadoes, conditions that Preston believed would create unforgettable viewing experience. He had sold tickets to nearly 30 visitors, charging $10 per person, planning an extended evening of demonstrations and displays. Miriam caught Henry's eye as she set down his food, saw something in his expression that communicated urgency, remembered his earlier warning about seeking shelter. She left quickly, heart racing, gathering her courage to spread the message he had given her. The visitors arrived as the storm began to build, wind picking up, clouds darkening to shades of green and black that suggested serious weather approaching. They crowded into the barn, dressed in expensive clothing inappropriate for the conditions, excited by the prospect of experiencing Henry's presence while nature raged outside. Preston welcomed them enthusiastically, his speech more animated than usual, fueled by alcohol and the large amount of money he had collected. Dalton stood near the door, nervous about the weather but unwilling to contradict his brother, watching the sky with growing concern. Preston began his standard presentation, describing Henry's size and strength, demonstrating the thickness of the chains, explaining the precautions necessary to contain such a powerful creature. The visitors listened with half their attention, the other half focused on the storm intensifying outside, wind now howling around the barn's walls, rain beginning to fall in sheets that hammered the roof like thrown stones. Lightning flashed continuously, thunder following so quickly that the gap between light and sound measured mere seconds, the storm directly overhead. "Watch this," Preston shouted over the noise, gesturing to Henry. "Stand and show these people what real strength looks like." Henry slowly rose to his full height, the chains attached to his wrists pulling taut, the central beam groaning under suddenly applied stress. He stood motionless for a moment, his head nearly touching the barn's high ceiling, his shadow enormous in the lamplight. Then, without warning or visible effort, he pulled. The sound of wood splintering competed with thunder, the central beam cracking along fractures that weeks of careful testing had prepared, the chain's anchor point giving way with shocking suddenness. Henry's hands came forward, still bearing the iron cuffs but no longer attached to anything, 12 feet of chain dangling from each wrist like steel serpents. The visitors screamed, scrambling backwards, pushing toward the barn door in panic. Preston reached for his pistol, but Henry was faster, his massive hand closing around Preston's wrist with pressure that ground bones together and forced the younger man to drop his weapon with a cry of pain. "Run!" Henry said, his voice carrying clearly despite the storm and the chaos, directed at the terrified visitors pressing against the barn's walls. "Run and never come back." No one needed to be told twice. The door burst open, visitors flooding through it into the storm, their expensive clothes instantly soaked, their dignity abandoned in pure panic. Some falling in the mud, others trampling them in desperate efforts to reach their horses and carriages. Dalton tried to grab Henry's arm, motivated more by panic than courage, and found himself lifted and thrown through the open door, landing hard in the muddy yard, stunned but alive. Preston, still held by one massive hand, looked up into Henry's face and saw death looking back. please," he managed to gasp, pain from his crushed wrist making speech difficult. "I have money, I'll pay you, I'll free you, please don't kill me." Henry studied him for a long moment, considering options, weighing justice against consequences, finally deciding that Preston alive and terrified might serve better purposes than Preston dead and martyred. He released the younger man with a push that sent him stumbling toward the door, following at a pace that communicated he could catch Preston any time he chose, but was allowing escape as a gift rather than a right. Outside, the storm had reached its peak, wind strong enough to bend trees parallel to the ground. Rain falling so hard it was nearly impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Lightning struck continuously, multiple bolts hitting the ground with each flash, the entire plantation illuminated in strobe light bursts that turned the scene into something from a fever dream. Henry stood in the barnyard, rain running off his skin, chains hanging from his wrists, watching as visitors ran for their lives. Horses panicking and bolting, carriages overturning in the mud. He raised his arms toward the sky, embracing the storm, and laughed, a sound that carried over the thunder, a sound that terrified everyone who heard it. Preston and Dalton reached the main house, bursting through the door, shouting for their father, trying to organize some response to the crisis unfolding outside. Malcolm emerged from his study with a rifle, demanding explanations, receiving only incoherent babbling about chains breaking and the giant escaping. He rushed to a window overlooking the barnyard, saw Henry standing in the storm like a statue, saw the barn's door hanging open, understood instantly that something far worse than a simple escape had occurred. He raised his rifle, sighted on Henry's massive form, pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, impossible to aim accurately in the storm's chaos, the bullet disappearing into the night. Henry turned toward the main house, his eyes finding Malcolm's window, their gazes meeting across the rain-swept distance. Then deliberately, Henry reached down and grasped one of the chains hanging from his wrist, swinging it in a wide arc, building momentum, releasing it toward the barn. The heavy chain crashed through the barn's wall, smashing wood and creating a gap through which wind immediately poured, almost the structure's integrity compromised in an instant. Henry repeated this action methodically, swinging chains like devastating weapons, smashing the barn from the inside out, each impact widening the destruction, the building's framework collapsing section by section. Within minutes, the barn was reduced to wreckage, walls fallen inward, roof sagging, the entire structure transformed from solid building to scattered debris. Still, Henry did not stop, walking through the ruins, kicking supporting posts, pulling down sections that remained upright, obliterating the place where he had been chained and displayed, erasing the symbol of his captivity with deliberate violence. Lightning struck the barn's remains, setting fire to dry wood despite the rain, flames rising and spreading across the wreckage, fed by lamp oil that had spilled during the destruction. Fire and water battled across the ruins, neither quite winning, creating a landscape of steam and smoke that looked apocalyptic in the storm's lightning flashes. Henry stood at the center of this chaos, silhouetted against the flames, looking less human and more like some force of nature given physical form. Vengeance incarnate, judgment delivered by hands strong enough to tear down more than just barns. Malcolm fired again from the window and again missed, and then Henry was moving toward the main house with speed that seemed impossible for someone his size. Preston screamed for his father to bar the door, but before anyone could react, Henry's shoulder hit the door with force that shattered its hinges and sent it flying inward. He stood in the entrance, rain streaming off him, chains dragging on the floor, backlit by the burning barn, looking like every nightmare the Winthrops had never admitted to having about their enslaved population rising up with righteous fury. "I could kill you all," Henry said, his voice calm despite the storm and the flames and the chaos surrounding them. "I could tear this house apart with my bare hands. I could make you understand exactly what you have done, make you feel exactly what I have felt. But I choose not to. Not because you deserve mercy, but because your fear will serve my purposes better than your deaths. You will tell everyone what happened here tonight. You will spread the story of the giant who broke his chains and walked away. You will make me into a legend that other enslaved people will hear about and take hope from. That is what you will do. Because if you do not, I will return, and next time, I will not show mercy. Malcolm raised his rifle again, but Preston grabbed his father's arm, understanding in his terror that Henry meant every word and that killing him would require more bullets than they possessed and more courage than they could muster. "Let him go," Preston said, his voice shaking. "Just let him go." Malcolm lowered the rifle and Henry nodded once, acknowledgement that wisdom had prevailed over pride, then turned and walked back into the storm. Chains dragging behind him, moving toward the tree line at the plantation's edge. Miriam watched from the cellar window beneath the main house, having followed Henry's instructions to shelter there with several other enslaved workers. She saw him cross the yard, saw him pause at the edge of the forest, saw him look back once at the burning barn and the damaged house, saw him raise one massive fist toward the sky as lightning struck nearby. Then he was gone, disappeared into the darkness between the trees, his footprints already being washed away by the rain, leaving behind only wreckage and flames and terrified white people who would spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. The storm continued through the night, lightning and thunder and rain that lasted until dawn. Longer than any natural storm should have persisted, as though nature itself conspired to cover Henry's escape. When morning finally came, the barn was completely gone, reduced to charred timber and twisted metal scattered across a wide area. The chains lay in the mud, both cuffs broken open from the inside, marks on the iron suggesting strength that should not have been possible but undeniably was. The footprints that might have shown Henry's direction ended at the forest's edge, the trail simply stopping as though he had dissolved into air. Malcolm organized a search party immediately, offering rewards for Henry's recapture, but the men who rode out looking for tracks found nothing. The storm had erased evidence as effectively as any deliberate concealment, and the forest was vast, thousands of acres of swamp and timber where a man could hide for months or years if he knew what he was doing. Some trackers claimed to find signs, massive footprints in soft earth or broken branches high above normal height. But these trails always ended mysteriously, leading in circles or stopping at rivers or simply vanishing without explanation. The story spread rapidly, growing in the telling, transforming from escaped slave to legendary figure within weeks. Other planters heard about the giant who broke his chains during a storm, about the barn destroyed, about the fear in the Winthrop's eyes when they described what happened. The enslaved population throughout the region heard versions that emphasized Henry's strength and intelligence, about how he planned his escape carefully, about how he chose mercy when he could have chosen revenge, about how he simply walked away when white men believed escape was impossible. These stories became tools of resistance, proof that the system's absolute control was illusion rather than reality. Preston and Dalton never recovered from that night. Preston developed a tremor in his hands that made fine work impossible. His crushed wrist healing crooked despite expensive medical care. He stopped hosting exhibitions of any kind, sold most of his horses, took to drinking even more heavily than before. Dalton left the plantation entirely within a month, moving to Charleston, where he told anyone who would listen about the giant who destroyed their barn, embellishing the story with details that made himself more heroic and Henry more monstrous. But the fear in his eyes when he spoke revealed truth beneath fabrication. Malcolm tried to maintain normalcy, insisting the incident was isolated, that Henry had been an aberration, that the system remained intact and functional. But he ordered new locks installed on every door, hired additional overseers armed with better weapons, treated the enslaved workers with slightly less casual cruelty, as though recognizing that pushing people too far might produce consequences he could not control. The barn was never rebuilt, the site left as ruins, nobody willing to work there after dark, the charred timbers gradually being reclaimed by weather and vegetation. Months passed, then years. The Civil War arrived and transformed everything, and still Henry was never found. Sightings were reported periodically, always in forests or swamps, always at twilight or during storms, always described in terms that blurred the line between human and legend. A farmer claimed to see a massive figure moving through trees along the PD River. A hunter swore he tracked prints too large to be human deep into the Francis Marion forest. Escaped slaves following the Underground Railroad spoke of a giant who appeared at crucial moments to guide them. To carry children who could not walk further. To deal with slave catchers who ventured too deep into territories they should have avoided. Miriam, who gained her freedom when Union forces occupied the region in 1863, lived until 1907 telling stories about Henry to anyone who would listen. She described his silence, his strength, his patience, his terrible mercy on the night he could have killed everyone but chose to spare them. She insisted that he still lived somewhere in the Carolina forests, watching from the shadows, protecting those who needed protection, a guardian spirit born from suffering and transformed into something that white people could not understand or control. Whether Henry Boone survived into the 20th century, whether he died unknown in some forgotten corner of the wilderness, whether the stories about him were true or embellished, these questions remain unanswered. What is certain is that the barn where he was chained and displayed did collapse during a storm, that Henry did escape, that no one ever found him or brought him back to captivity. The Winthrop plantation itself did not survive the war. Burned during Sherman's march, the family scattered, their wealth destroyed, their legacy reduced to a footnote about men who chained a giant and learned that some bonds can be broken by will as strong as iron. The ruins of that barn site can still be found if you know where to look, overgrown now but recognizable to careful observers. A few charred timbers still visible beneath the soil and vegetation. Locals avoid the area, claiming it feels wrong somehow, heavy with presence that watches from the surrounding trees. Occasionally, hikers report seeing a massive figure in the distance, too large to be human but moving with human intelligence, always glimpsed at the edge of vision, always gone when looked at directly. These sightings are dismissed as imagination or misidentification, tricks of light and shadow in the forest's depths. But on stormy nights, when thunder rolls across the Carolina lowlands and lightning illuminates the old forests, some people claim to hear chains dragging through the darkness, the sound of iron against earth, accompanied by footsteps too heavy to belong to any normal man. They speak of a giant who walks the land where he suffered, a spirit or a survivor, keeping watch over places where injustice occurred, ensuring that certain stories are never forgotten, that certain memories remain alive in the landscape itself. Whether Henry Boone still lives or whether his legend has taken on life independent of the man himself, the effect is the same, a reminder that human resilience can exceed any cage designed to contain it. The Winthrop's descendants scattered across the country now rarely speak about their family history. When they do, they gloss over details about their ancestors' involvement in slavery, preferring sanitized narratives about agricultural heritage and Southern tradition. But sometimes, in private moments, they admit to knowing the story about Henry Boone, about the barn that disappeared in a single night, about chains broken and mercy given when revenge would have been justified. They speak of this with discomfort, awareness that their wealth and position came from systems that produced such stories. guilt mixing with defensiveness in complicated emotional responses that they cannot fully articulate. The barn exists now only in photographs taken before its destruction, images that show a sturdy structure surrounded by fields, no hint visible of the cruelty it contained or the dramatic end it would meet. These photographs are preserved in historical archives, studied by researchers interested in plantation architecture or material culture. The building's true significance lost to most observers who see only wood and nails rather than the human suffering those walls contained. But for those who know the full story, who understand what happened in that barn and what it represented, these images carry heavier weight, evidence of systematic dehumanization and the violent resistance it eventually provoked. In the end, what remains is a story, told and retold, changed and embellished, but carrying essential truth at its core. A man was enslaved and displayed as an object of curiosity, treated as less than human by people who justified cruelty through constructed hierarchies of race and power. That man chose patience over immediate rebellion, chose his moment carefully, and when that moment arrived, demonstrated that the chains binding him were never as strong as his captors believed. He destroyed the symbol of his captivity, spared his oppressors when he could have killed them, and walked away into a freedom he seized rather than waited to receive. Whether Henry Boone died shortly after his escape or lived for decades in the wilderness, whether he helped other escaped slaves or survived alone, whether the sightings reported over subsequent years were authentic or imagined, these details matter less than the story's central message. No system of oppression is absolute, no chains are unbreakable, no silence means acceptance, and no patience should be mistaken for weakness. The barn is gone, reduced to ash and memory, but what it represented persists in histories both official and unofficial, in stories passed down through generations, in ruins slowly being reclaimed by forest, in legends about giants who walk among trees where no man should be able to vanish but somehow did. The storm that night in April of 1858 destroyed more than a single barn on a single plantation. It marked a moment when myth and reality merged, when one man's resistance became symbol for broader truths about human dignity's refusal to be extinguished regardless of circumstances designed to destroy it. Preston and Dalton spent their remaining years flinching at thunder, seeing shadows too large to be human in every gathering darkness. Malcolm died without ever fully understanding what happened or what it meant, his worldview unable to accommodate truths that Henry's escape revealed. And Henry himself, wherever he went and however long he survived, carried forward knowledge that freedom taken by force means more than freedom granted as favor, that strength used with wisdom achieves more than strength wasted in rage. The story ends as all stories must, but the questions it raises continue beyond any ending. What does it mean to be human when others insist on seeing you as object? What patience is required to wait for the right moment when every moment is suffering? What mercy is possible after enduring systematic cruelty? What legends emerge when historical record fails to contain lives too large for comfortable categories? The barn is gone, the chains are gone, Henry is gone, but the space where these things intersected remains charged with meaning, heavy with presence, alive with possibility that some truths refuse to be buried regardless of how many years pass or how much effort is expended to forget them. In the Carolina forests, where morning mist rises from swamps and ancient trees create shadows deep enough to hide anything, where thunder still rolls across the land and storms still wash away footprints, locals know to show respect when passing certain places. They avoid ruins where barns once stood. They speak carefully about history. They acknowledge that land remembers what people choose to forget. And on some nights, when conditions are right and attention is focused properly, they see what might be a massive figure moving between trees. Too large for human scale, but too purposeful for animal. watching from distances that make certainty impossible but recognition unavoidable. The story of Henry Boone, the 7-foot man who broke his chains and vanished into legend, remains alive not because historians preserved it in official records, but because communities remembered it in unofficial narratives passed from generation to generation. It survives because it carries meaning beyond its specific circumstances, because it speaks to universal human experiences of suffering and resistance, because it reminds everyone that systems claiming absolute power actually possess fragility they rarely acknowledge. The barn is gone, collapsed into ruins and memory, but what it represented, both as symbol of oppression and as site of resistance, persists in landscapes physical and imaginative, in stories told and retold, in legends that refuse to die because they serve purposes deeper than entertainment. And so the tale concludes where it began, with ruins and questions, with chains twisted impossibly in mud that has long since dried and been washed away by countless subsequent rains, with footprints that led nowhere because freedom's path sometimes leaves no trace that trackers trained to recapture can follow. The barn is gone. Henry is gone. The Winthrops are gone. The plantation system that supported all of it is gone. But the story remains vital and necessary, a reminder that human dignity cannot be permanently chained, that patience is not weakness, that silence is not emptiness, and that giants walk among us still, visible to those with eyes trained to recognize them in the shadows between trees where light and darkness merge into possibility.